The broccoli you ate today is not the broccoli that your grandparents ate. Over the last 60 years, there has been an alarming decline in the nutritional quality of our food, associated with a shift from natural farming to chemical farming. The food looks the same, but the science tells a very different story. And three science experts are here today to connect what's happening underground to what's happening inside your body.
The quality of our food is very much dependent on how the food is raised and what is put into the soil by the farmer. We have to be respectful of nature and not interfere with these processes.
I'm Norma Flood, and I'm an integrative and functional nutritionist. Welcome to Go With Your Gut in collaboration with Triada. For today's episode, I want to welcome my co host, Damone Richardson. He's here today to make sure our discussion from soil to food to health makes sense to everyone listening here today. Welcome, Damone.
Hi, Norma. Thanks for having me on today.
Excited to have you here. Now, Damone, you are a Chicago based real estate broker with a deep commitment to community. Damone became involved with Triada to help advance awareness of nutrition's vital role in overall well being. As a Triada board member, his passion naturally aligns with Triada's mission of bridging agriculture and medicine for healthier communities. He has served as president of the West Loop Community Organization and as an operating board member at the Chicago Maritime Arts Center.
That is correct. And also, Norma, you and I are both UW Madison graduates. We're Badgers. And we both actually jumped into pharmaceuticals right out of college before jumping into the wellness arena. And we both share a real fondness and enjoyment of the great outdoors.
And I love that. I love how, like, we have such similar backgrounds and interests, and here our paths collide with Triada today. So, love to be with a fellow Badger.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I do have roots in the Midwest, of course. Grew up in Wisconsin. But with that said, I'd like to introduce all of our amazing scientists here today. Damone and I are definitely honored to be in the presence of three top Triada scientists whose work is waking people up to the reality of our food system and its connection to our health. Triada's mission is to connect agriculture, nutrition, and clinical care to heal people and the planet from clean soil and water to quality food and elevated health. More specifically, Triada's Pearl study includes all of these components, which our scientists will talk about today. So, welcome everyone. Great to have you. And I know that each of you studies a different thread of this collaborative of effort to establish the linkages between the soil, the environment, the food on our plate, and how that impacts health outcomes. So, with that said, I'd like to introduce each of you. I'll start with Dr. Daniel Stein. He serves as chairman of the board for Triada. He is a physician scientist with over 3 decades of leadership in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. Recently retired as chief science officer at Mosaic Diagnostics. He previously spent 25 plus years as a professor of medicine, attending physician, investigational review board chair, director of 2 biomedical research corps, and as clinical director. His career has centered on translating metabolic and biochemical research into precision diagnostics and therapeutics. Today, he will share how toxins are interrupting our metabolic systems and health outcomes.
Yes, and next we have Dr. John Fagan, who serves as a collaborator for Triada. John is a leading authority on sustainability in food and agricultural systems, biosafety, and food authenticity. He's co founder, chairman, and chief scientist at the Health Research Institute, where he investigates links among generative, regenerative agricultural practices, food safety and nutrition, and consumer health. He's also chairman of Global Family Farms, which trains farmers in regenerative organic agriculture. He's a professor of molecular biology and leads research on transcriptomic and metabolic effects of transcendental meditation. And today he'll shine a light on how our genes interact with one another and with our environment to produce health outcomes.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Lynn Yeoman, who serves as a collaborator for Triada and has over 20 years of experience as a biomedical researcher specializing in cancer research and nuclear protein chemistry. He then transitioned into medical education, gaining expertise in curriculum design, small group learning, educational technology, and accreditation review. He went on to serve in leadership roles implementing innovations, including enterprise learning management systems, graduate medical education evaluation software, and online testing platforms. In 2020, Dr. Yeoman founded Yeoman Consulting Services, LLC, providing strategic guidance in pharmacology, biotechnology, and medical education. Today, he will offer insight into heavy metals and toxic forever compounds found in water and soil, and subsequently in foods and clinical specimens, including blood, urine, and stool. And that's quite an impressive group of scientists we have here today. So thank you for being here.
Yes, and in addition, Norma talked about what drew me to Triada, so I'd like to pose the question to the three of you. What drew you to Triada?
Well, I've always believed in clean food and healthy lifestyles as a physician and as a scientist. I was under the fortunate position to actually set up a regenerative organic farm up in the wilds of Vermont. I never thought too much about it until I joined my new position with Mosaic Diagnostics, where there was a heavy emphasis on toxicology and looking at all the toxic exposures that we have in the environment. And then it really came full circle that, clean food, which comes from clean soil, is so important. And in my position with Triada, I made the acquaintance of Carla Heiser, and she had organized an amazing group of scientists to look at the Pearl study. And this was looking at what are the environmental and genetic exposures that predispose people, young people particularly, to autism spectrum disorder. And I was very pleased to be able to help her in my position with the company. So we, among many others, I should say, supported over $1 million worth of in-kind support. And it is an outstanding study, and it's just getting to the publication stage. And even after I retired from Triada, she asked me to stay on in a scientific role, and I'm very pleased to do that.
I was introduced to Triada by a friend of Carla Heiser, and that was Arlene Levy, who has known Carla since early days of work in Romania, where they actually helped children that were suffering from HIV. At that point, I learned that Triada was actually connecting agriculture with nutrition and environmental health and in clinical care. And so I saw this as the opportunity to share and use some of the information that I had collected as a scientist and as an educator, and was particularly now interested focusing on quality of life improvement in general in those ways.
Yes. Very interesting paths by which my colleagues have come to Triada. Uh, Mine is not that different. It's that we've had a long-standing interest in understanding the relationship between how farmers farm, the quality of the crops that they produce, nutrient density, et cetera, and also the impact of those crops on the health of the consumers, the people who eat them. And that's really what Triada is all about, is those connections and really understanding that and uh, having some influence in that area in terms of policy and other things as we go forward. And I was also very attracted by the depth and breadth of scientific uh, collaborators that have been brought together under the the Triada umbrella. And so those two things really made it make a lot of sense to get involved. So here I am today.
That's great. I'd just like to add one thing at this point, which is because the name has come up a couple of times, Carla Heiser. So Carla Heiser is the founder of Triada, and she is the reason that we are all here today connected.
Absolutely. We can't forget about Carla, bringing us all together here in one place for this mission, really. And that leads me into just taking this deep dive, starting with the soil. I'd like to start there because, as we said, it does start with the soil and our climate. So, what we're understanding is that soil health has declined dramatically in modern agriculture. And so, how are current agricultural practices affecting soil health and the climate? Would we want to start with pesticide use and the method of farming?
Yes, that would be a good place to start. And the state of the soil today in most American and most industrialized countries is it's very discouraging because the soil in its natural state is a living thing. It's full of microorganisms and little critters that um, make it, it's alive with these organisms, and they contribute to the nutrition of the crop. So the compounds that they produce and leave in the soil are things that nourish the crop. But what we see today is that the practices of agriculture, particularly the use of very concentrated caustic fertilizers, and also this wide range of chemical pesticides, that these things kill the the living creatures in the soil, and you end up with the soil being just a physical matrix that the seeds are planted in. And the only thing that keeps them alive is the chemicals that the agriculturalists put on the soil. And those chemicals don't really fulfill all of the needs of the plants. And therefore, those plants are generally weak and more vulnerable to disease, more vulnerable to pests, and unable to produce crops that really nourish the individual fully and completely. So, from on every level, the system is not it's only working in terms of a way of producing something that can be sold, but not in producing really good food.
Right. So that's one thing to think about is that we usually think of pesticides as how it's in our food and it's affecting us, but we first have to think about how it's affecting the soil and these microbes in the soil that have these metabolites, what you would call postbiotics, just like we have postbiotics from fermented food and microbes in our gut, right? So how the soil is very similar to our gut in that way. But yes, how that nourishment of the soil is the very most important thing, and also in keeping our soil healthy and our climate healthy.
Well, one thing I would like to say is that while limits have been established for some of these agents, I think one thing that we are very concerned about as a group is the fact that they accumulate. We're not talking about just one of them, but frequently several of them being presented at the same time. And the fact that what this makes possible is that not only perhaps one dose, but then again subsequently and yet another time. So that unless they are removed or not used initially, This allows effects that are being studied but are very difficult to deal with because of their complexity. You're having more than one thing acting at the same time, and sometimes one will synergize or affect the level of activity of the other. And finally, I worry a lot about the farmer. The farmer is out there right in the field, in the process of actually administrating these chemicals for weeds and for insects and things of that nature, so that their exposure to this is just out of sight.
Right, right. Yeah, we can't forget the farmer and what they give for all of us, not only their time and energy, but their health, right? And how that's having the greatest impact on them versus those that are consuming the foods.
So, Dr. Yeoman, you touched on it briefly about the fact that they're not removing these pesticides from the soil. So, my question for you is: I hear a lot about organic and regenerative practices in farming. Is there a way that you can reverse, the toxicity in the soil?
There certainly are opportunities to reverse the toxicity, and those are of experimental interest to us to find out which ones are most effective and most rapid. And it also it moves into the way water moves in groundwater, and as well as how we treat sewage and try to remove things that we don't want from it. And to be honest with you, most public sewage disposal units are not capable in the present time of dealing with all of these agents effectively.
I can add, and I endorse exactly what Lynn said. Unfortunately, our sewage is to this day unregulated, in contrast to in our soils in terms of contaminants. Whereas the water and the air, we have an EPA that takes care of that. So everything that gets dumped into the sewage ultimately gets dried up and then given away as free as quote unquote organic fertilizer to farmers. And it's, of course, free to them. And so our farmlands are increasingly contaminated with everything that we threw down the drain. And so there's a lot of toxic chemicals there that adds to the herbicides and pesticides. So that is of a big concern. And the other thing I wanted to add, it's sort of the flip side of using these herbicides and pesticides. And with monocropping, we're basically depleting the soil of the essential minerals that are so important for health and for balancing the body and being able to detox from whatever exposures you get. And so if you're just adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, you'll get, high yields of crops, but they will be essential mineral depleted. So they will not be nutrient dense. And their ability to make other plant hormones and phytochemicals, which are really important for the health of the plants. So they're susceptible to disease. And we in turn eat those plants. And when we eat them, they're very good for human health. So everything adds to everything else. Our old soils from when the pioneers, went west, it's been much less or it's been eroded over the years. But most importantly, the essential minerals have been depleted, and we've been throwing on all these toxic chemicals, which are building up in some cases. John, I know, is particularly an expert on glyphosate, and maybe he wants to say a word about the fact that glyphosate gets metabolized to an even worse compound that hangs around for a much longer period of time. And other scientists that who work with Triada tell us that a lot of glyphosate can be bound up in the soil under certain environmental conditions. And when you add things like phosphorus under the right conditions, it can come right back out and you can get a massive dose. So, John, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, glyphosate is an herbicide, and it's the most heavily used pesticide. Herbicides are a class of pesticides, and it's the most heavily used chemical in agriculture, both in the U.S. and globally. And this is compliments of a very effective marketing program by the chemical industry. Um, and this compound uh, binds to metals and will pull them out of the soil so they're not available to the plant. And this can be very serious. The plants can be actually weakened because of this. At the same time, these pesticides this particular pesticide can build up in the soil literally over years to the point where when, as Dan described, uh, certain compounds such as phosphorus are put into the soil, they can kick the glyphosate off of the soil particles, make it free, which means making it active in its herbicidal form at that point, causing very serious problems for that field. Uh, Whole crops can be destroyed because of this phenomena. So it's a serious thing that way. And these are only a few of the problems that come up with just one pesticide. There are hundreds of pesticides that are being used. And in any given vegetable or fruit that you buy at the grocery store, there could be anywhere from 3 to 14 different pesticides in that one crop. And as Lynn said, these things can synergize many times, even though you have only small amounts of 14 things. When you put them together, it's a serious hit on your physiology.
Yeah, and our government regulators have never studied that. What is the synergistic toxicity of adding one on top of another on top of another? So John's describing the bad things it's doing for the soil. So we have sick plants, so they're vulnerable and susceptible to pests. So that's bad for them. And then when we eat these crops, we ingest the glyphosate and these other pesticides and herbicides. And that can have direct adverse effects on human biology. So I don't know, Norma, if you wanted to talk about the microbiology aspect a little bit later, but one of the main ways that particularly glyphosate, often this is a common theme among these pesticides, is they will affect pathways that are particularly vulnerable in weeds, but they will also kill off helpful microbiology, helpful bacteria in our gut that we've evolved to have. In fact, we have 10 times more bacterial cells in our body, in our colon, than we do in terms of cells in our whole body.
Right.
And some of those, the good ones that we are evolved to have and that make essential signaling molecules and essential vitamins for us, those get selectively killed off, and you get resistant pathogenic bacteria that cause disease. So people may have heard of dysbiosis, or sort of a unbalanced bacteria in the gut
Right.
can lead to inflammation of the gut. And as the gut gets inflamed, the whole body gets inflamed. So there's a lot of downstream adverse effects. And, being an endocrinologist, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a lot of these also act as what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. So they abnormally attach to receptors in our body for various hormones, and they partially activate or partially deactivate our normal signaling processes. And as a result, you can have a lot of downstream chronic diseases that occur from that.
Yeah, one thing I wanna go back to, Dr. Stein, I think that's a great point, how, it's how these chemicals are interacting with our body. And, when we hear that these chemicals are generally recognized as safe, which is kind of that gross term, I mean, that's usually on our foods, but the FDA can't keep up with all of these chemicals and the long-term effects, or even go deep enough in microbiology to really understand what's really happening, because they really don't understand the full picture, and they don't understand the synergistic effects. But directly, even these chemicals, once they're in our gut, how they do kill off of a lot of our good gut bacteria, and those bacteria are really our first line of defense. Over 70% of our immune cells are in our gut. And the bacteria are very protective of that system. And we know that our gut is our second brain. We know that it affects our metabolism. It even affects our genetic expression. So when you're harming your gut microbiome with these chemicals in foods, it's having impacts on all types of different systems, every system in your body, really. And our intestinal wall is only one cell thick. And so when you have that inflammation, you have that compromised cell wall lining, you have leaky gut. And then all of a sudden you have this bacteria and larger particles of food crossing into your bloodstream. And that's causing issues to our health as well, which increases inflammation even further, causes more of these, food allergies that we're seeing, food sensitivities, chronic disease, more mental health issues as a result of all of these things combined.
Yeah, I think it's a strong argument against increasing the complexity of what is added to the soil that is not necessary. In the sense that it's a problem for the biome of the soil, which has jobs that it's doing for the roots of the plants that produce the crops. And then as it transitions its way into the foods that we consume and ends up in our gut, it introduces factors that just make the whole situation a whole lot more complex. There's just a basic simplistic approach to this that cleaner is better. And I mean, that's both on the side of bringing up the strength of the nutrients and minerals that are uh, helpful to us and reducing the levels of those things that we're so concerned about them or acting together. And in fact, producing levels of toxicity that are not usually studied. These levels are studied individually for the thing, not for 10 or 12 of them at the same time.
Mm-mm.
I think, John, you might like to indicate some sort of an insight of some of the complexity of things that um, you are aware of that because of the sensitivity of the methods that you use to reveal things that are actually present in both in soil and from crops grown under these conditions.
Yes, it's we use mass spectroscopy, which can scan the soil or scan a food. It doesn't ask, is this chemical present or is this chemical present, but can ask, what are all of the compounds? What are all of the compounds that are in that food or in that soil? What are they? And how much of them is there? So, with a tool like this is like X ray vision for a scientist such as myself. It's really exciting to be able to have a tool like that. And what it reveals is that, that the quality of our food is very much dependent on how the food is raised and what is put into the soil by the farmer. And it just shows that we have to be respectful of nature and not interfere with these processes as much as we seem to be doing in this day and age. And we have to remember that the food we eat is not just carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. There's intelligence in that food. There's a structured intelligence in that food that is in the form of these hundreds, literally thousands of different compounds that are present in traces in the food that we eat that nourish every aspect of our physiology. And so we don't even have the beginning of understanding the depth of what's going on there. And we shouldn't be messing around with it before we understand what's really going on. And in fact, that's a big problem that we have today is that we have people trying to make a business out of out of these pesticides and these other chemicals before they even know what's really good for the soil, what's really good for the plants, what's really good for human beings. So we have to have more respect than we often have in this respect.
I mean, one aspect that really strikes me about the modern farm is that, as John had mentioned, the soil has become dead. There's no life there other than the plants that you grow in it. And as a result, the ability of the soil to retain water becomes compromised. And you get a lot of water runoff, you get a lot of erosion, it's a very, very bad vicious cycle. And if you look at, truly healthy soil, which is, regeneratively, tended soil, it's fluffy, it's moist, it's full of microbiology and little critters. Everything from helpful molds to helpful bacteria that are breaking down the little rocks into the essential minerals. That in turn is being taken up by the plant. The plant, feeds the bacteria and everything there. It's a very wonderful symbiotic relationship, that most of us probably, at least briefly, came across in college. But it's a beautiful system, and when it's operating properly, you get nutritious plants and healthy plants that can fight off pests, and they in turn can provide healthy nutrition for us.
I could tell when you were describing that, Dan, that you were probably thinking about the soil in your own farm and how it is so lively and beautiful and, as you said, fluffy, and alive. That's what soil should be. And so much of it these days are not that way. But we're going to come back to that. That's what regenerative agriculture is all about.
Yeah, I even know in my little home garden, I go by all the earthworms. If there's a lot of earthworms crawling in there and critters, you know you have a healthier soil that is um, better established.
So, with regard to the soil, you've kind of discussed how degraded it has become over time. I guess my question for you is there a difference between organic farming and the farming methods employed by, these big corporations and the pesticides that they put in there? Is it that the organic farms are also having these toxic materials in the soil?
Very good question. And uh, organic is better. It is not ideal, but it is better than what we have in conventional agriculture. So often what we're having is farmers that have been doing conventional agriculture taking up organic, and they still bring along a little bit of the conventional thinking, but that's evolving. And with that, we're seeing much better agriculture. This whole regenerative agriculture movement, it embodies this move towards living soil and a system that regenerates itself over time. And so it's a very beautiful thing that's happening. And at the same time, we don't have everything figured out yet.
Well, I would just add on top of that, there are, certain intermediate steps that are immediately possible. So by far the largest pesticide is glyphosate, as I think we may have mentioned, just hundreds and thousands of billions of pounds applied, particularly here in the US, North America, but really around the world. And believe it or not, 80% of the use of glyphosate is just to dry crops, not to avoid weed infiltration. And it is a very cheap way to do it, but there are other very reasonably priced and effective means of drying crops. And I should mention that when you dry crops with glyphosate, you end up killing them. My colleagues in the agricultural sciences tell me you get something called bottom end rot. And as a result, you get fungal overgrowth of these crops, particularly corn, for instance. And that in turn gives you the toxins from the mold. They're called mycotoxins. And those are also very bad for human health. And you could eliminate 80% of that just by going to an alternative way of drying crops. And only 20% would be left in terms of, its herbicide use.
Right.
And of course, there are other, helpful things that we can look forward to in the future. Things like for some crops, you can use lasers, and instead of to eliminate weeds, and you don't need any herbicides at all. And scientists are working on bacterial ways of actually remediating the soil and chewing up all the glyphosate.
Yeah, I have a question there. I'm sorry to interject there, but isn't it true that now we hear how they're spraying glyphosate, especially on wheat and oats, and it's supposed to be used as an antifungal, yet you just mentioned that there's more fungal growth as a result of using the glyphosate, correct?
Well, I'm not aware that they use glyphosate to kill mold.
To prevent mold growth, right? Because you're drying it out.
Yeah, that does happen.
Yes.
Well, okay, I understand what you're saying. Well, they want to get a uniform drying. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you have a uniforming drying process, you can very effectively harvest the crop. Now mold could be there if you have a wet crop, but I don't believe that glyphosate would kill the mold. If anything, it by causing the plant to die, you're actually inducing mold growth. So I could be wrong here, but my understanding is, that you're strictly using it as a drying agent to optimize the economics of harvest.
Right, right, and the way what I understood in some ways was drying it out prevents the growth of mold to a degree, but it's interesting, this is new to me that, mold it increases the chance for mold later. It's very interesting.
I think it would be worthwhile to just explain to people a little bit about what this drying the crop is. It technically is called desiccation. The problem that it is designed to deal with is the fact that you can't harvest efficiently wheat or beans or things like that if the plant is green and flexible and alive and all of that. So, what they do is they desiccate it. They spray the field 2 weeks before you want to harvest the crop. They spray it with glyphosate and it kills the crop. In that 2 weeks, there's enough time for the crop to get dry and crispy and easy for the harvester to come through and pull the grain out that way. But the problem with it, and the one that bothers me the most, is that when you desiccate, there are many times that doesn't even rain before you harvest that crop. And so the full dose of that chemical, the pesticide or the herbicide in this case, the full dose of it is on the crop. And when you isolate it, it's there in huge amounts. We have measured in our laboratory cases where there's more than 1,000 nanograms per gram of glyphosate on the crop. Those are levels that if you ate that every day, twice a day, it would make you very, very sick and cause oxidative stress and all of this sort of thing. So this desiccation using chemicals is a very unhealthy thing for the crop.
Yeah, and that takes me right into over half of what kids eat is ultra processed food. So let's not even get to the fact that there's a lot of chemicals added, but the chemicals that are there in the wheat or the oats that are used in a lot of these processed snacks.
Mhm.
And you're saying that they have very high levels of glyphosate, and then you're ultra processing this flour or oat to contain even a higher concentration going into smaller bodies, right? All of these kids eating snacks, like popular name brands too.
Well, I don't know that, at least in terms of the herbicides, I'm not aware of any data where you're concentrating it, but they continue on in the processing chain. And the processed foods, of course, you're taking out all the essential minerals and all the phytochemicals and things of that sort. So they're very nutritionally depleted. So it's empty calories. The contamination can persist, and I know in some types of processed foods you can get concentration. I think that's more of an issue with toxic metals. I'm not aware that that occurs to a large degree with herbicides, but if John or Lynn have alternate information, I'm happy to listen to that.
I don't have anything alternative, but I'd like to say that particularly in children, because children are not just smaller adults, yes, they enhance the ratio of whatever that intake is by virtue of their being smaller in meter square size, whatever you're considering as far as dosing. But in particular importance is the fact there are things going on in youth that are very important. Think about bone development. Think about nervous system and brain development. And their tendency to absorb contaminants is generally more efficient than in adults, so that these levels, while they're used on populations that do include children, this, I think, requires some insight into just how much more strongly the effect is occurring for smaller candidates like kids really are.
No, I think Lynn makes a really good point that, as you mentioned, children are not little adults. They're growing, they're more susceptible to any toxic exposures, and the kinds of regulations that we have on what's a quote unquote safe exposure is basically pointed towards adults. It's not assessed in children. And the fact of the matter is that you can have exposures and the outcome from that may be delayed by months or even years. And there's no studies looking at that. And I'm sure we'll get to it when we talk about toxic metals, but the government has finally agreed that there's no safe level of lead exposure, and that affects both adults and children, but particularly children because they have growing brains and they have growing bones, etc. And there is no safe level.
Right, and on that note, I would love to jump right into that topic, the issue of heavy metals in soil and food and how that's also adding to the problem of our food system.
Well, metals exist in our environment. There have always been part of everything. But having said that, we're seeing increasing levels of exposure to toxic metals throughout our environment, in our air, in our water, and in our food. And as an aside, just because you're organic doesn't mean the crops there haven't been exposed to heavy metals from the soil. Organic means what you put into the soil is healthy, but if it's pre-contaminated with heavy metals, you're not testing for it. So we don't know that. So that's one little caveat. If you're downwind from a coal plant, there can be a lot of mercury exposure. If in the old days before, they banned lead from gasoline, I guess that was in the 1970s. But anybody who lived close to the freeway, got exposed to a lot of, lead in that regard. There's arsenic in many places, particularly in rice crops, things of that sort. So these metals exist, and another thing that is a bit of a misconception sometimes is if you only eat healthy and have a lot of smoothies, particularly with things like kale and related greens actually concentrate heavy metals in their tissues. So if you are unlucky enough to be growing it in a contaminated plot, you're actually getting a mega dose of those heavy metals. So some people have been poisoned with lead and thallium. These are things that are very, very serious. Um, so unfortunately, nobody, with very few exceptions, very few commercial outfits are actually testing their products for heavy metal exposure.
Yeah, and I'd like to speak to that, Dr. Stein, because you make a good point with the greens. And there's always such a trend to get your vegetables in by doing a lot of these greens powders and how they have that risk for having very high levels of these heavy metals that are concentrated into this concentrated greens powder. And it just shows why variety is so important, why eating the whole plant food is more important versus thinking you can get it from a powder. In fact, you're causing more harm. I also saw a Consumer Report study that they studied a random sample of protein powders and how 70% of these protein powders had higher than safe levels of lead and were not safe for daily consumption, which a lot of people consume these, smoothies on a daily basis. So it's a great point.
Well, that's not only true for protein powders, but unfortunately for infant formula. The government is supposed to be testing for that and doesn't. And so private organizations have done this, raised money through philanthropy. And essentially every single infant formula, which by the way doesn't have healthy fats in it, it has, polyunsaturated vegetable oil fats, but that's a separate issue, are contaminated. And now it's unfortunate some women, can't breastfeed. But the safest thing is, of course, to breastfeed if you can. And if you're going to make or if you're going to serve formula to your child, you should seriously consider about making it yourself, or at least getting a brand that advertises that they're testing for toxic chemicals and toxic heavy metals.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to something that Normal mentioned a few minutes ago, and that is the diversity of the diet. It's really important because think of it this way. This farmer has land that naturally has a high level of lead. This farmer over here. This farmer has grows kale as well. They don't have a lead problem. The kale from this farm is going to be safe. The kale from this isn't. And so they both go to market. Sometimes it's sort of like a lottery. Sometimes you get the good stuff, sometimes you get the bad stuff. Eat diversely. Eat different things. Don't get stuck on one greens powder. Eat multiple ones. Take them from different places and eat fresh as much as you can. That's going to make a big difference. And again, not the ultra processed stuff. It has not good oils in it. It has, the risk of these concentrations of different heavy metals or things like this, and it just is, unavoidable. So diversity and avoid the ultra processed.
I'd just like to interject one thing. One of Carla's favorite sayings is "eat the rainbow," which I think we can all agree is a great saying.
Eat the rainbow, beautiful.
Yes. And it makes for a more resilient microbiome because the more variety you have in plant foods, the more variety you have in microbes because they have their taste preferences, So the American Gut Project, which has the largest data collection of the gut microbiome, they show that those that have at least 30 different plants a week have the highest diversity in their gut microbiome, which is reflective of your resilience.
I just have the one question about heavy metals. And I believe it was Dr. Stein who said it that these heavy metals settle in the body. And you mentioned in particular is detrimental to children and their development because they are still developing. So, my question for you is, and maybe for all three of you, is so this heavy metal is in the food, we're ingesting the food. Where do these heavy metals settle in the body? And how does it manifest this toxicity? And is this something that, a person can feel?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, we know that they affect, pretty much all these toxic metals, childhood development, particularly neuronal development. How their brain is evolving and maturing. It can result in reduction in IQ. It can result in behavioral problems. They tend to be, ironically, even though they're metals, they tend to cross the blood-brain barrier and be sequestered there. Although the major place where they lodge tends to be in the bones, and so that's bad for bone development, of course. And ultimately, as you age, particularly for women who've gone through the menopause, these toxic metals start coming out, so we can be re-exposed to them. Some metals have a particular proclivity to going to the lungs, some to the kidneys. So really major organs can be affected. And how are they affecting things? Well, the heavy metals, particularly mercury and lead, cadmium, they tend to displace healthy metals from their biologically active sites, particularly in the little energy power plant of the cell called the mitochondria. So they dislodge iron and they dislodge copper, and they result in a process called free radical formation, which causes oxidative stress. So this means you're not making adequate amounts of energy from your mitochondria. You're causing inflammation. You're causing basically all organs in the body not to be fully functional. So that process is a little bit naturally occurring with aging, but you're accelerating that. And you're accelerating all the diseases associated with poor energy production from the mitochondria and with inflammation. And when you get right down to it, excessive oxidative stress and inflammation really has been linked to every single chronic disease that we have in our society. And sadly, over 60% of us are affected by chronic disease. And even among children now, over 40% have one or more chronic disease. So this is an epidemic of disease that we didn't see in previous generations. So is this only due to toxic metals? No, but that for sure is playing a role. I think the exposures to other toxins in the environment is playing a role. And then the flip side is all of us are exposed to metals, even, 100, 200 years ago. But unless you were massively exposed to something, you tended to be pretty healthy. You probably died of infectious disease, but other than that, you probably were pretty healthy. But they also ate an organic, regenified diet. So their ability to deal with stress, to deal with toxins, was, if you will, fully functional. So we talk about optimal health, not just, what's average out there, but you want optimal health. And optimal health means having a full complement of vitamins, essential minerals, and having the ability to meet whatever stresses in terms of toxins you're exposed to. Now, we want to limit the exposures. Zero exposure is impossible, but we want to limit it to, some realistic minimum. And so, therefore, eat healthy, eat organic, regenified foods, uh, drink clean water. We haven't really discussed that, but water is a huge source of contaminants, and so everybody should, unfortunately, with few exceptions, they either need to test their water and prove that it's clean, or they should really have reverse osmosis. It's a sad statement to make, but most of the water systems in America these days are heavily contaminated.
Yeah, it can become overwhelming, and not to do this to everyone, not to overwhelm everyone even more, we have the concern of the pesticides and these heavy metals, but now we hear more and more about these forever chemicals that we're all carrying in our body, especially the PFAS. And PFAS, I always have to look at it, stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and so they're a very large family of synthetic chemicals. And, we're learning that these PFAS are binding to a lot of important minerals like magnesium and zinc and vitamin D. They're interrupting hormones or acting as hormones. So let's dig in a little bit into that one. I'd love for one of you to explain first, when we talk about forever chemicals, why are they called forever chemicals?
I'd like to take a shot at that. They're a large family of relatively new man made chemicals that are incredibly stable. I mean, their half life in the environment and if they get into the human body are just hundreds of years. I mean, if they are not dealt with in a particular way. And they owe this basically chemically to the strength of the carbon fluoro bond. And they're fabulous because in industrial situations where they have to exist as a lubricant or a surface protectant or something like that, it lasts. So that one side of them, their attribute that makes them so useful in water resistance, resisting heat, stains, all kinds of things, lining pans that you cook with, and so they're kind of like everywhere. And we come back to the issue as part of the production process, they're ending in the same solid waste system that is not capable of removal. There are ways, newer, more modern ways, and I must say more elaborate and more expensive, but they do not exist in most cases yet. So they'll go straight through and come right out the other end of these treatment plants.
So are these PFAS, are they found throughout our water system basically? Like even an organic farm, if they're watering their farm, we should expect that these PFAS are everywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. They're in the groundwater, they're in the soil. Um, they're in our food, they're in our bodies. They're such a challenge. Just to give you some of the areas where they originate, industrial manufacturing, I hinted to that. Did you know firefighting foam is a source of them, actually? What about landfills? They're pretty rich in it, and so the water that goes through them and goes adjacent to them to other areas where wells are, that gets contaminated. Uh, the residuals are in the wastewater treatment system, and there's decades of widespread commercial use on these products, so that this has been accumulating.
There's this industry out there called the chemical industry whose motto for many years was better living through chemistry. So in creating the image that, oh, they're good for us and they're doing things good for us. Well, when it came to this particular area, they should have known, but they did know better. They knew that these chemicals would last for a long, long time. They knew that this class of chemicals were endocrine disrupting and had other toxic effects, and that because they were so stable, they would accumulate in people's bodies and they would accumulate in the plant and all of this sort of thing. There are a large number of organofluorine pesticides out there today. Organofluorine PFAS, forever chemical pesticides out there. And they're being used and sold to farmers and the farmers are told these are good for them. They're the best you can use right now. But here's something that the farmers don't know, that there will come a time when governments finally figure out that they've had the wool pulled over their eyes with these things, and they're going to say these have to be banned. And the farmers that have used these on their land will then be stuck with hundreds of thousands of acres of land that can't be used for
Mm.
agriculture. What will be the effect of this is that the decisions of the chemical companies to commercialize these toxic chemicals will have taken away from the farmers the ability to bequeath that farm to their sons and daughters. It takes away that from the farmers, and it will be at least 100 years or longer before that land is usable again for agriculture.
Wow. So regenerative practice, even with regenerative practices, it would be 100 years before they could use their land safely again.
It could well be that long
Wow.
because these are literally forever chemicals.
Mm.
Their half-lives are so long that if you take it in, you're gonna die with that in your body.
Mm.
The point you're making is exactly correct, and it's not even theoretical. It's already happened. I know there were news reports in the last year or two where a farmer, I don't know if he inherited the farm or bought the farm, but anyway, had been using conventional practices, and for some reason, the farm was tested for PFAS chemicals, and it was just off the charts. And it was so high that the feds said, that's just not healthy, and you can't grow produce on that land. So it's a real issue and it accumulates over time. Now, of course, they're playing whack-a-mole as they try to phase out the longest lasting ones. They just substitute ones that have a slightly shorter half life, and the regulatory agencies are constantly playing catch up. So what do we do? Know your farmer. Hopefully, they have clean water and clean practices. You're going to limit the exposure. Even though a organic regenerative farm might be doing everything right, they still may have a little bit of glyphosate and other pesticides that blow in from the neighbor's conventional farm. There still may be a little bit of heavy metals there, but hopefully not much. So you're going to definitely be better in that regard. And the other point I wanted to make was, if you have a farm and you're using sewage, as your fertilizer. That's going to be heavily contaminated with all this bad stuff. So the toxic herbicides and pesticides, the toxic heavy metals, and now these PFAS molecules. So we have to be lobbying our legislators to ban the use of recycled, if you will, sewage waste as fertilizer. In Europe, for instance, they burn it so as to limit the amount of toxic exposure to the environment. Is that a little more expensive? Yes, I guess you have to admit that. But at what cost, and who should bear that cost? Does the public at large bear the cost? So I think, being someone who's very liberty minded, I believe that people have a right to know and they have a right to make their own decisions. You shouldn't have some large corporation that's going to distribute this risk across the population just to boost their bottom line.
Yeah, we have to, and I think what Dan said, or I can't remember now who, but the fact that replacing them with something that's a couple of years less half life is not the answer. They have to go and be handled in manners that do not allow them into these systems.
So, with all of this said, we're feeling pretty hopeless here. This is really like ignorance is not bliss. We need to become aware of how serious this problem is. And I think that's where Triada comes in and the importance of Triada, especially this recent pilot study, the Triada Pearl study. I would love to hear a bit about that, about how you've helped families, especially those with autism. Because the thing about autism, and we could go a little bit into the genetics as well, but those with autism have more sensitive systems. They're more sensitive to their environment, they're more sensitive to chemicals in food. And I think that they're the canaries in the coal mine to kind of wake us up to how food and environment is in fact affecting us. And so I'd love to hear why Triada matters, how important this study is, and where Triada is going with this.
Well, maybe I should give an overview of what the Pearl study was. So, first of all credit to Carla Heiser for organizing it and bringing her team together. But what they did was they looked at a cohort of 36 individuals, from children to young adults. They had autism spectrum disorder. They had behavioral disturbances. And what they said to the families and to the individuals was, we want you to eat the My Plate, you know, from the USDA. Obviously, that's been revised since, but just eat a normal balanced diet. And the only change we want you to make is to eat organic. And in addition to that, they made sure that they had access to clean water, water filters, or spring water, that kind of thing. They also gave them vitamin and mineral supplements. So remember, there's this yin and the yang, and your ability to detox is very dependent on having adequate nutrition on the one hand, and you want to limit your exposure on the other. And then what they found, it was a 12-week study. So, first thing that was very shocking was that 100% of these 36 individuals had toxic levels of chemicals in their body. The vast majority, 31 out of 36, had toxic levels of mold toxins in their bodies. So that was very surprising. Now, the good news was when they were on this diet for 12 weeks, there were measurable improvements in their behavior and they really felt better. They had less GI symptoms. So it was a short term study. The genetics are currently being sussed out. But preliminary evidence would suggest that these young people, with autism spectrum disorder, had susceptibilities to toxin exposures and to excessive amounts of inflammation. So you're taking a group who genetically, are within the population, but are more susceptible to a degree of exposure. We're all exposed. But you want to limit the amount of exposure and you want to improve your ability to detoxify from that exposure. And a point I like to make, which was taught to me by Joe Pizzorno, a famous founder of the Institute for Functional Medicine, is that our ability to detox may vary by a factor of 10,000. Think about that. So certain individuals are going to be much more susceptible to any degree of toxin exposure. And those who are very severely affected, like those with autism, are, as you mentioned, Norma, the canary in the coal mine. They're very, very sensitive. But there's a large degree of people who are just sort of ill. They're, nobody can sort of put their finger on it. They go to the doctor and he says, well, it's all in your head. All your numbers, come up normal. But in fact, they're being, slowly poisoned by everything that they're exposed to. And remember, this is sort of a synergistic scenario. Their ability to detoxify is impaired because they don't eat a nutrient dense, healthy diet. So it's so both things are so important. Avoiding toxic exposures on the one hand, and making sure you have a nutrient dense diet on the other, and that includes clean water, and it includes other things that we take for granted as well in terms of healthy lifestyle. Getting good sleep, getting a proper amount of exercise, uh, you know, trying to deal with stress, people give lip service to these things, but they're actually very, very important and everything interacts with everything else. But you want to maintain a good state of health to be resilient in the face of whatever exposures you have, and you want to limit those exposures.
Right. When you talk about genetics and the susceptibility there, each of our bodies is unique in how we react to these toxins in our body. It may show up in our skin, it may show up in thyroid health, heart disease. And so some of these things might not happen till later in life because it's a cumulative effect, like you said, versus those that are more sensitive, but connected to so many systems that we don't even realize the source.
There are no symptoms for a lot of people for a very long period of time. For it's kind of this silent, low level exposure that occurs over years, and then on the tail end of it is the great difficulty in getting rid of them.
The thing that I was just gonna say, listening to all of this, the forever chemicals and all of these things, I was quite alarmed a few minutes ago. But now, having listened to Dr. Stein talk about the fact that you can detoxify from some of these things, depending on your diet. So, how does that work? I mean, it's in the body. What is it in the foods that we consume that would help us detoxify?
Well, remember, conventional food, in addition to having, the exposure to these pesticides and herbicides, they just get nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, those are essential minerals. Nobody would dispute that. But there's the micronutrients. So things that are a little more common, like zinc, to things that are a little less common, like selenium and manganese and copper. All of those are essential minerals. And when we lack those in the diet and we're eating McDonald's and we're eating processed foods, we're not getting that. So we're essentially nobody is starving in America, or almost nobody is, but we have nutrient depleted, calorie dense food that's leading to chronic illness, obesity, heart disease, cancer, all these things. And as it applies to children, not only are they starting to get childhood obesity and diabetes, but it's impacting their behavior, it's impacting their brain development, their genetic potential in terms of what their ultimate IQ should be. So we're harming our whole society by not eating healthy, and trying to limit our exposures. So I think a helpful note is that there's a lot we can do. As they say, vote with your pocketbook, and there's nothing that's a better investment than your health. And the best kind of investment in your health is preventive investment. So, be healthy, stay healthy, and avoid all the expenses and all the heartbreak and all the disability that comes with chronic disease. And people say, "Oh, I have health insurance." Well, the sad thing is, health insurance really doesn't pay for anything in the preventive sphere. So you have to take it upon yourself, and you have to, seriously read labels. And if there's more chemicals there than you can understand or pronounce, it's probably processed food and not good for you. So the closer to the source, the closer to the land, the closer, the animal, the food crop, whatever it is, the fresher it is, the better it is. So even conventional vegetables, if they have the rainbow of colors and they're nice and fresh, that's better than anything that's canned. Now, of course, organic would be even better still. But if you have to prioritize fresh food, eating the rainbow. Lots of colors, be it not only green but red and purple, blue. Anything with those really really rich colors are very healthy. They're full of plant phytochemicals that are great for human health. So don't let your kids subsist on a chips and whatever diet. So, hot dogs and chips, that's not a healthy diet.
Right, and if you're trying to squeeze in those smoothies for kids, if to get them used to these new different foods, just don't add all the powders, add some whole fresh ingredients. Like even if it's frozen organic blueberries if they're not in season and other whole plant foods mixed with a good fermented yogurt or something. But just there are ways to even add it to those that are picky eaters. And change can happen gradually, and that's what they've shown in the Triada study that it's possible. In 12 weeks.
That's right. So the nice thing is, it's already showing some indications of real benefit, very interesting scientific observations. Carla and all the rest of us involved are planning an extension. So we're applying for further funding to make it a much longer and bigger study and to get really strong statistical significance so that we can go to the skeptics out there and say, look, this is hardcore gold standard science and you can't deny this. But I think we know enough already that eating healthy, drinking healthy is better for you. Um, so you may have people who are picky eaters. It's true, but sometimes that's due to the dysbiosis in their gut, right? And they just don't feel well. And when you can reset their gut, they'll feel better. But of course, the best time to start is in early childhood. So teach your child to eat well then, and you'll probably have better luck later on.
And keep it fun. I know that even just having a small garden or a plant, getting kids interested in food, even taking them to a farmer's market, when they have that direct connection with food, they're more interested in eating it. I think this discussion was so critical today. In a world where we have more nutrition information than we've ever had before, and there are so many health food products and supplements that are being pushed onto consumers that they feel that that is the answer to better health. And so that's why I love Triada because the whole focus is the soil and the food, which is of the greatest importance. So, with that said, I would love to hear from each of you, just as a takeaway. If there was a message for everyone, for every parent, physician, educator, or policymaker, what is a takeaway message that you would provide today?
You've already said it, but it's worth repeating maybe 3 or 4 times. Eat fresh, eat diverse, go for real food, not highly processed food or just supplements. Supplements should be that. They should be only, when there's something that's lacking somewhere. But the main thing is fresh, abundant, healthy, real food.
Well, John stole my message a little bit, so I obviously endorse it.
It's worth saying again.
I will gladly say it again, but I think the color corollary to that is vote with your wallet. So buy organic, support your local farmer. For that matter, get to know your local farmer. They're wonderful people. Invest in clean water, be it a Berkey filter for filtering the water at a minimum. Maybe you can put in a under the sink reverse osmosis and enjoy the great outdoors. So get sunshine, get some exercise, reconnect with your fellow man and woman, and stay away from your iPhones and iPads. Reconnect with nature. So that's what I would say.
Well, I guess mine is eat well, drink well, as far as clean products. And don't put off symptoms or things that are new and different. that occur, get them checked out and make sure it's not one of these things that you're more sensitive to than anybody else.
So I just add one thing to what Lynn just said there is yes, I totally agree with that. Sadly, our conventional medical system will just, do a routine battery of tests and almost always will find nothing wrong. So even though it's a small component of our medical care system, it's actually the fastest growing part, and that's called functional medicine. So that can be an MD, it can be a DO. Actually, there are a lot of educated chiropractors, and there's also a category of practitioners called naturopathic medicine doctors, NMDs or NDs. And these are all people who are clued in to this way of thinking. Now, it's not that, some MDs aren't clued in, they are, but they're the exception to the rule. So when you go shopping for a practitioner, shop for somebody who's on this wavelength. And, and if you find that person, hold fast.
So this has been a truly enlightening conversation for me today. I've learned about a lot of the challenges that we have, and obviously, some communities have more challenges than others, and that's a hurdle we'll have to cross as a community. But I do want to thank you for your insights today. I hope that I was able to boil some of these things down. Clearly, there's a lot of work that we have to do, but I am really glad to have Dr. Yeoman, Dr. Fagan, and Dr. Stein on our team, and I look forward to the work that we are going to be doing together in the future. So, thank you a lot for your time today.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Normal and Damone.
Thank you all.
We appreciate what you do for us. What today's conversation makes clear is that the crisis on our plate didn't happen overnight, and it won't be reversed overnight. Triada's research scientists, whom you heard today, are translating their research into something we can actually act on. The question isn't whether the food system needs to change. The question is whether we'll demand that it does, with every seed planted, every meal chosen, and every dollar spent. Start with one thing tomorrow. Your body, and especially your gut, will feel the difference. You can learn more about Triada and support their mission to connect agriculture, nutrition, and clinical care to heal people and the planet, from clean soil and water to quality food and elevated health. Find them at triadaworld.org. I've included a link to their site in the show notes below. And if you're only listening, please head over to my YouTube channel, where you can also share or subscribe to help support this mission for better health. Until next time, be well.